Hello there. Once again, welcome to the Set of the Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're here every week meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues, and we're so glad you joined us on this week's show. We're going to talk about an issue that's going to become very high profile on the other side of January 1st, and that's redistricting. And it takes place at the federal level and the state level and even the municipal level. And today's expert, Keith Gaddie, is going to come in and try to illustrate what's in front of us.
Yeah, Keith talks about this a lot. He teaches it at the University of Oklahoma in the Political Science Department. He's a recognized expert on it, the pros and cons of how you do it and what should be done. And we're really pleased he'd give us his time today to talk about redistricting.
It's always controversial, but
and it has huge implications.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can be well represented or misrepresented solely by how the redistricting process takes place. So we're going to learn more about it today on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
Natural gas is the gateway to a better world of energy. Instead of waiting, natural gas moves us forward now. Instead of finding ways to make dirty energy cleaner, natural gas simply is cleaner. We can use it to create our own energy, a wealth of new jobs, and keep more money here at home. Learn more at chk.com. Chesapeake, America's champion of natural gas.
Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate. We're accountants. We do taxes, business valuations, estate planning, and consulting. And we're right here in Oklahoma, working with the owners of small and medium-sized businesses. Steve Wilsey and Stuart Meyer have the resources and the experience. Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate in Oklahoma City and Tulsa.
There's no waiting at the St. Anthony ER.
No waiting.
Announcing the end of ER waiting at St. Anthony Hospital. Go to saintsok.com and reserve your time online.
Why didn't we think of that?
Welcome back to the Set of the Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
Today we're really glad to welcome back an old friend who's been on the show before, Dr. Keith Gaddie. Keith did his undergraduate work at Florida State University and has had a talk with their football team this year after meeting the Sooners. He did his master's work at the University of Georgia and his PhD work at the University of Georgia. For 14 years or so, he's been on the faculty at the University of Oklahoma in the Political Science Department. He has authored, co-authored, or edited about 14 books, articles, and the like. He's a prolific writer. He also is a regular visitor on television talk shows, doing radio updates and television updates on what's going on in the life of politics and politicians. And he's always kind to give us his time. We sure are glad to have you back on The Verdict.
Well, Ken, it's a pleasure to be here, Mr. Mayor. Good to see you.
Great to see you too, Keith. Well, the census, I guess, is done. I guess they're still adding up the numbers.
Yes.
But the census has been completed, and so on the other side of this calendar year, we're going to start the every 10-year process. I know there's a word for every 10 years, but it slipped my mind.
Decennial.
Decennial, thank you. You have to go to the doctor for the word. Okay, with the decennial process of drawing the lines for the federal level and the state level and the local level. Give us some background. What's the history of drawing these districts?
Okay, well, the first thing is a census is required by the Constitution, and when we visited on this before, we pointed out to people, it's constitutional to count you. That's the first thing. It's right there in the Constitution. It's required by law, by the Constitution. Every 10 years, we count everybody for one purpose, which is to apportion representation for Congress. So we count everybody up, we get an actual enumeration of people, and then it's determined how many seats each state gets, and there's a formula that's applied to this that we won't go into now because this is not a math lesson yet. But then what happens is within each state, we draw representative districts that are of roughly equal population in order to apportion the congressional districts in a state and also to apportion the state legislative districts. And since the 1960s, a series of Supreme Court cases have required equal population in the apportionment of districts for state legislatures. So that's why we do this, is it's a constitutional mandate under Article 1 of the Constitution.
Okay, so state legislatures not only do the state line drawing, but they also do the federal line drawing.
Yes.
And they don't do the municipal line drawing. So the
Right.
cities do their own municipal line drawing. So it's not doesn't seem to be a level playing field at every stake of the way there.
No, and it's funny, for a member, I was up in D.C. recently actually working with a lawmaker on the apportionment bill, a version of the apportionment bill for next year. And this is very frustrating for members of Congress because when congressional district lines get drawn, their fate's entirely in the hands of state lawmakers. State lawmakers get to draw their own districts. Municipalities get to draw their districts. So the most control is really in the hands of state legislatures. And because cities and counties are creatures of the state, it would be permissible for state legislatures to take that power back also if they wanted to, in terms of constraining home rule. So the state legislature really has the strongest hand to play in this entire process.
Well, did the founders of our federal government, did they bring this idea from Europe, or do you have any idea where this started?
Well, what happened is it arose partly out of practicality and partly out of our English parliamentary tradition, which is we inherited a mechanism of geographic representation where you elected people from townships or villages or constituencies. And we got in the habit of apportioning power in state legislatures by geography. It used to be that Congress would elect members at large or from multi-member districts from the states. And by the 1840s, Congress had decided we don't want to share constituents with other representatives. We want to be the only representative of our district. So very early in the Republic, we settled on a district geography-based pattern of representation. The problem is that a lot of this was county-based representation and gave counties equal representation. And as we became an urban country, this meant that cities were woefully underrepresented, and this led to litigation in the 1960s. So this arises out of an English tradition, out of our British parliamentary tradition. But the notion of one person, one vote is really an American concept arising out of the Constitution.
Well, with any kind of power comes the opportunity for skullduggery. And I guess the redistricting skullduggery is called gerrymandering. Can you
Yes.
tell our viewers, just like you did last time you were on, but tell our viewers again the derivation of the word and what it really means?
Well, gerrymandering is named after Elbridge Gerry, who was a signatory of the Declaration of Independence and a governor of Massachusetts. And what happened is Governor Gerry crafted a set of legislative district lines in order to advantage his party in a set of elections. And one of these districts was designed in a very unique pattern that kind of looked like a salamander. And somebody said, well, we'll call that a gerrymander then. And the word stuck, and gerrymandering came into the English language. So it is a word that was created for this purpose out of a political event.
Now, it may be elementary to some of our viewers, but to me it was informative to hear that what drives the redistricting process is population. It isn't necessarily where they live, it's how many.
Yep.
And therefore districts have weird lines sometimes to go out and pick up pockets of population, I suppose. How does that work from a partisan standpoint?
Well, a party will always seek political advantage whenever it has the opportunity to set the rules. I mean, that's just logical.
And whoever's got the power at the state capitol,
Yeah.
a political party that has the power at the state capitol, holds the keys to the redistricting.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so if we have a Republican legislature with a Republican governor, we should expect to see a map that Republicans will be happy with. If we have a Democratic governor, there will be some efforts to mitigate against those efforts to seize Republican advantage. Specifically here in Oklahoma, it's hard to draw a map that isn't a Republican advantage map regardless of who draws it. But when you look at, the thing we have to remember is as much as you try and get partisan advantage, the congressional districts have to be of exactly the same population, down to a deviation of no more than one person. The congressional district,
Wow.
and we do it. We do it. It's a fiction we engage in, but we do it because a lot changes between the time that we get the data, when the data were collected, and when we get to draw the maps. But for the state legislative districts, what happens is we have to keep the population variation down to a range of basically plus or minus 5%. And that population deviation has to serve some general public policy, okay? Like not splitting a county or a city needlessly or keeping a community of interest together. You have to be able to explain why you have population deviations. But the goal is to keep the population deviations as small as possible because the right to vote is invested in the individual, and we don't want to dilute the translation of that vote into representation in the legislature. And that's why ever since Reynolds v. Sims and Westbury v. Sanders back in the 60s, the courts have been very, very strict on population deviation. There is no deviation out there that couldn't be ruled illegal.
We only have 1 minute left in this segment, and so I want to take this question on to the other side. But it appears to me in 2001, when the last time we did it, we started really enforcing the idea of creating safe seats for the state legislature and as well as the congressional races. It seems to me that one of the many results of that is that it has created a more partisan primary process. So to hold your own seat, you have to move to the edges. Whether you're a Democrat, you have to move to the left, and if you're a Republican, you have to move to the right. Otherwise, you can't survive the primary process because we have created such a split along these congressional lines. Has that been studied? Is this a relatively new idea, or is it just something that came to the forefront in 2000?
Well, this conversation's been underway for about a decade, and Mick, you're exactly right. It really came to a head in 2001.
Yeah, I tell you what, let me just take a break, and we'll come back and let you get it out. It took so long with my question, I didn't give Keith a chance to answer.
But it was a good question.
But we will give him plenty of time to answer when we return on the other side of this break on The Verdict.
I'm Dr. Suzanne Van Kooten, a research hydrometeorologist at National Severe Storms Lab, and I'm a Chickasaw. There's a stewardship there, I think, that's within Native Americans and the protectionist of the land, and are we going to leave things better than when we came in, that came across in how I did my job. I had a true passion for it because I realized that this was what we had always done. We'd always been so involved with the land and taking care of the land, but also taking care of people. So that is truly the stream that you go down as a meteorologist. You want to protect lives and property. The Chickasaw Nation does an amazing job with our education programs. There are no excuses for you not to succeed as a Chickasaw in education. That's fundamental. That's fundamental to the success of the nation, is this education aspect, because knowledge literally is power.
What's your idea of security? A good-paying, sustainable job, a solid economy, less dependence on foreign energy? We can achieve it with the help of one industry, American oil and natural gas. It creates energy, jobs, and a strong economic base we can rely on. New technologies open vast reserves that will supply our energy needs far into the future. Because security, by every definition, is worth protecting.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers and our guest Keith Gaddie. We're talking about redistricting, and before the break I posed a question about creating safe seats and whether or not that had an effect on the primary system, because it seemed to me that what we've done is created a more partisan environment by creating the safe seats 10 years ago.
Mick, you're absolutely right. And the thing is, one of the questions you have to ask, though, is are the safe seats created or do they happen? To some extent, they're created by how they're drawn. But the other problem is, as a people in America, we're sorting ourselves out. Birds of a feather flock together, and we're discovering that people of a common political and economic and social and cultural persuasion tend to cluster together. So, when you go to certain parts of the city, you're going to see a lot of people who think the same way about politics living together, so the seats are necessarily safe.
Is the Tea Party the result of redistricting? Is a lot of their fuel come from a redistricting process?
I don't think so. The Tea Party is a product of a lot of, it's a product of many streams. We need a whole other show to deal with it, or maybe several. But in part, it's a product of some frustration with the size of national government, frustration with debt and deficit spending. And part of it is just a natural reaction to having an economic downturn where your party's out of power. You know, we saw this with the Perot folks in the early 90s. We saw this with the Wallace 72 voters, who were more social conservatives than anything else. We've been down this road before in America, and we'll go down it again. We have these periodic fits of conservative outrage that harkens for a simpler time, and it's usually a reaction to a bad economy.
Let's go back to the federal level
Yes,
just
sir.
for a minute. There was a time, I recall, when Oklahoma had 6 congressional districts and 6 congressmen, congresspersons. Well, they were all congressmen at the time. Now we're at 5. And this is the time, I guess, where a determination would be made whether we get one back or we lose another one and go to 4.
Yep.
What makes that determination, and are we close to the line on either side?
Okay, we're in good shape to hold 5. Let's start with that. And we almost held on to 6 last time. It was a near thing. We were a few seats south of the cutoff line, sort of the Mendoza line of representation for you baseball fans. What happens is there's an apportionment formula where you start by assigning every state one district, because everybody gets one. Then the remaining 385 districts are assigned based upon a complex formula that you can Google up and look at on the internet if you care to look. But it's a method by which you systematically assign seats to states, in part based upon reducing the size of their overall deviation of their the overall size of their district. And what would happen for Oklahoma is, to get a 6th seat back, we would have to be able to show that by adding a 6th seat, on average, the average size of our district would be larger than another state getting that additional seat, and what their average population would be. That's it. It's more complex than that, but that's it in a nutshell. And every 10 years, Congress and the apportionment bill can set the formula, but they've used this formula for roughly the last century.
Let me ask one other question. This is just trivia. But I can recall, I think it was North Dakota, that of course had 2 senators, as all states do, and only had 1 congressman because of population. Is that still the case?
There are several states that have that. North Dakota is one.
Oh, there are more than?
There are 7 states that have a single congressman, and Delaware being one, obviously. But most of them are up in the high plains. And what's interesting is that whole Midwestern region is shedding population. 100 years ago, the 12 Midwestern states that are immediately north and northeast of us, from Ohio out to the Dakotas, had 143 members of Congress. Now they're down to 98.
Wow.
Yeah. And the South and the Southwest are just booming. Arizona had 1 congressman for years, and they're going to have 10 next time.
Is there anything written down that says a district has to have the current office holder in that district? In other words, and I know at the congressional level you don't have to live in your district.
Right.
First of all, very few people know that, and it doesn't ever happen in Oklahoma that would be the case, but it doesn't happen. But at the state legislative place, what if they redrew the lines and a legislator all of a sudden was living in the same district as another legislator?
Yeah. Well, and part of this would have to do with the timing of the drawing of the lines as to how fatal this would be. There's no such thing as an incumbency property right to a seat, okay? Usually legislatures, because the incumbents are drawing the lines, they consider where the incumbents stand. And we have a situation in Oklahoma, we're probably going to have to shed a seat in the State House, or maybe 2 in western Oklahoma. We'll have to shed a seat somewhere in southeastern Oklahoma. We're going to have to maybe move a seat out of southwest Oklahoma County. And there are other areas that have population gains where those seats relocate. Usually this would be a problem because of the incumbents. You'd end up with more incumbents than you have seats to run in. It won't be a problem for us because term limits allow us to figure out where the seats are to be shaped around, so incumbents don't have to worry about this too much. But if you have a stand where you run law, you end up having to run against your opponent. State of Wisconsin allows you to move into another seat, run, and if you win, you have to prove residency in the district within 45 days of election. In the state of Georgia, you have to have lived in a district for a year before filing, and Georgia has always remapped late. So you always end up with incumbents running against other incumbents or being forced out of office. And for years, Democrats used it to retard the growth of the Republican Party of Georgia.
Okay, crystal ball.
Yeah.
What are the controversies going to be in Oklahoma on redistricting?
You know, I'm not sure if there will be that many controversies because we've got a fairly easy task. We don't have a lot of voting rights issues in this state. And it's relatively easy to make sure that minority communities have seats that allow them to elect candidates of choice. But in western Oklahoma, you've got lawmakers that want to keep seats. And there are more lawmakers than there are seats available potentially. You have lawmakers who might want to run for Congress. They may want to see some tweaking around the edges of the congressional districts. It's all about the allocation of power, but there's a lot of talk about cleaning up the map, making the districts more compact, not splitting counties up very much. And both parties' leadership have been coming out talking about this in forums like this. When we get into the actual map making, we're going to see whether or not that rhetoric can hold. We can defend a map that isn't a pretty map as long as we don't violate the law. The challenge is going to be whether or not the rhetoric, which follows the logic of how the public thinks about what the maps want to look like, is going to be followed through when the time comes to draw the map, and some folks see their political careers on the line.
Well, you know, there's the Republican-Democrat reason to draw a line to try and create a safe seat or an unsafe seat. And then there's also the rural and city issue of what you said. If western Oklahoma has been losing population and they have representatives out there, they might draw a line to come in and take part of a metro's population and then draw the line back out. And of course, that doesn't necessarily please those of us at City Hall who have a representative who doesn't feel a closeness to the city and may live an hour or more away.
Well, and this is the big challenge. Best guess, census numbers come out in December. The best guess is that about 38% of the state will live in a rural county. 38% of the population. 40-something% will be living in a truly metropolitanized urban core county, so either Comanche, Cleveland, Oklahoma, or Tulsa counties. And then the balance is going to be in the suburbs. Those suburbs and the edges of these metro counties have always been used to pick off people to bring rural districts up to population. It seems like there's a lot of desire to clean up that map, but I'm just going to tell you flat out, around the country, this is always a difficulty with rural voters and rural lawmakers, that they simply cannot understand why they can't keep their representation even as their counties shrink in population and the rest of the state grows. And rural-urban is the old classic split in Oklahoma, and that may be where the real fight is.
Is the Oklahoma control over redistricting basically in the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem?
I'm not even going to speculate on that because, the presiding officers have strong control over the process, but any member could introduce a bill. And
so not necessarily.
Right, exactly. It's, the hope is that leadership will be able to exercise a strong hand on this. The tradition in Oklahoma is that each chamber will draw its maps and then the other chamber will approve them. And then it goes to the governor. And we have not had a situation where a governor has vetoed a redistricting bill recently. Frank Keating worked with the Democratic legislature, got state legislative maps approved, and the fight was over the congressional map. So,
we went from 6 to 5, and so and only when one congressman decided not to run was that really fixed, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the funny thing was, we ended up with one more congressman not running that year, but we didn't know it until after the map had been set. It was one of the great surprises of the process. You never know what's going to happen.
I see it. That's when Largent ran for governor?
No, JC decided not to run for re-election.
That's right.
And he announced right after we got the map.
And Wes Watkins decided not to run.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keith Gaddie, always a wealth of information. Thanks so much for coming on the show about redistricting.
Thank you much, Mick.
Yeah, thank you.
Ken.
Appreciate
It's a pleasure to be here.
And Kent and I will have a final word when we return.
Good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, wrapping up a show with Keith Gaddie, who was illustrating the many complexities of the reapportionment process and all the line drawing that'll take place after the calendar year.
Yeah, just like certain moths come out every 17 years or something, gerrymandering comes out every 10, and we're about to enter that process, folks. So get ready to hear a lot about gerrymandering and arguing about districts, and once it's over, you won't hear about it for another 10 years.
And it happens at the city level, and it happens at the state level, and it happens at the federal level, and there are no doubt there's going to be some controversies that emerge from this. It appears that Oklahoma will retain its 5 congressional seats. And with the sudden turn up and the tick up in population growth, there's a chance in another 10 years we might be able to get that 6th seat back, but it's certainly not a guarantee at this point. But interesting to note that the state legislature is the group that determines the federal process.
Yes, as well, and could do the municipal if they chose to, but don't.
No.
Don't choose to. Oh, don't forget the book. Don't forget the book.
Keith Gaddie is also a murder mystery writer. He's written Ghost on Ventnor's Landing. Check it out. Kent and I'll be
Amazon.com.
We'll be back next week.
The preceding program was produced exclusively for the Cox Channel.